The wind arrives first. Not the crisp autumn breeze that fills a harbor sail, but something else entirely. A moving wall of polar air that turns spray into needles of ice before it hits your face. The North Atlantic in winter doesn't kill slowly. It kills methodically, degree by degree, wave by wave, stripping heat from human tissue faster than the body can generate it. 30 men ride a wooden platform across this liquid predator. No cabin, no hearth, no brazier tucked below deck radiating warmth into frozen hands. Just an open hull, 60 feet of flexing oak and pine, and the gray infinity of freezing water stretching to every horizon. Imp spray breaks over the bow in continuous sheets, soaking wool cloaks that freeze stiff within minutes. At night, when the rowing stops, body temperature begins its quiet descent. Shivering starts, then confusion, then the fatal sleep. A modern sailor, dressed in synthetic technical gear, would have hours in these conditions, maybe less. These men have weeks ahead of them, weeks of exposure, of wet cold, of wind that never stops. The distance from Norway to Iceland, 600 miles of open ocean. To Greenland, another 800 beyond that. No harbor, no respite, no fire. Yet they survived, not occasionally, but routinely. They made these crossings for 3 centuries, carrying families, livestock, trade goods across water cold enough to stop a human heart. They didn't just endure, they thrived, while building networks of settlement that stretched from Scandinavia to the edge of the known world. The question isn't whether they suffered. Of course they suffered. The question is how they lived. The Irminger Sea, stretching between Iceland and Greenland, holds a particular reputation among the world's hostile waters. Here, the cold East Greenland current collides with the warmer Irminger current, generating weather systems of startling violence. Storms materialize within hours. Sea ice drifts south in fragments the size of farmhouses. The water temperature, even in summer, rarely climbs above 5 degrees Celsius. In winter, it approaches freezing. This was the highway the Vikings chose, not occasionally as a desperate gamble, but as a regular route. Archaeological evidence confirms Norse settlements across the North Atlantic by the late 8th century. Iceland colonized around 870 CE, Greenland by 985, and brief settlements reaching the coast of North America by the year 1000. But these weren't single expeditions of hardened warriors. Families made these journeys. Children, livestock, the elderly. The voyages became routine enough that sagas describe them almost casually, focusing more on the politics of arrival than the mechanics of survival during crossing. Yet the mechanics were everything. The Oseberg ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway, shows the reality of Viking ocean-going vessels, 22 meters long, 5 meters wide. An open deck from stem to stern with nothing resembling a cabin or enclosed space. 15 pairs of oar holes. Nowhere to hide from weather. The Gokstad ship, slightly larger and built for deeper water, follows the same pattern. Magnificent craftsmanship creating a platform that offered zero protection from the elements above deck. A small tent structure, called a tjald, but could be erected when the ship was at anchor. A temporary fabric shelter for sleeping or waiting out weather in a protected harbor. But in the open ocean, during active sailing or rowing, the tjald was worse than useless. It created windage, destabilized the ship's balance, and blocked the crew's ability to respond to sudden changes in sea state. In a storm, it became a sail trying to tear the ship apart. So it came down, and stayed down. Fire presented an even simpler calculation. The longship's hull was oak, pine, and tar. The deck was wood, The rigging was rope treated with pine tar and beeswax. The sail was wool, often sealed with animal fat for water resistance. Introducing an open flame into this environment meant introducing the possibility of losing everything, ship, cargo, to an inferno in the middle of an ocean that gave no second chances. Some ships may have carried small soapstone lamps or braziers for use at anchor, in dead calm conditions, under constant watch. But in any kind of sea state, in any wind, with water coming over the rails, fire was impossible. The Vikings crossed freezing oceans in wooden bowls with no heat source. The human body maintains a core temperature near 37 degrees Celsius. When that drops to 35, hypothermia begins. Shivering intensifies. Cognitive function degrades. At 33 degrees, confusion sets in. Speech slurs. Coordination fails. At 30, the shivering stops, not because the body has warmed, but because it no longer has the energy to generate heat through muscle contractions. Below that lies unconsciousness, cardiac arrhythmia, death. Wind accelerates every stage of this process. The wind chill effect isn't psychological, it's a measure of convective heat loss. A calm day at 0 degrees Celsius allows the body to maintain a thin boundary layer of warmer air near the skin. A moderate wind at 15 knots strips that layer away continuously, creating an effective temperature of -10 degrees. The body loses heat, as if standing naked in air 10 degrees colder. Water is worse. Thermal conductivity of water is roughly 25 times higher than air. Immersion in water at 5 degrees Celsius can render a person unconscious in under 30 minutes. You don't need to fall overboard. Constant spray, soaking through clothing, creates the same heat drain across hours instead of minutes. The Viking crews weren't sitting in calm conditions hoping for the best. Well, they were riding ships through water that broke over the bow with every fourth or fifth wave. They were working in wind that never dropped below a stiff breeze. They were drenched continuously in water cold enough to stop thought. And yet the sagas record not mass death from exposure, but arrival. Landfall, settlement, a continuation of life on the far shore. Something in their system worked. The longship sits low, impossibly low by the standards of later ocean-going vessels. The freeboard, the distance from waterline to the upper edge of the hull, rarely exceeds a meter even when the ship rides light. Load it with crew, provisions, and cargo, and that margin shrinks further. The Gokstad ship, one of the best preserved examples of Viking ocean-going design, drew less than a meter of water when fully laden. This wasn't a flaw. It was the point. A tall ship catches wind like a sail even when rigged properly. The hull itself becomes a surface for the wind to push against, creating lateral force that heals the vessel and makes it harder to control in crosswinds. Medieval cogs, built a few centuries after the Viking Age, stood high out of the water with castle-like structures at bow and stern, while they were stable platforms for trade and combat in coastal waters. In open ocean storms, they became torture devices, rolling violently as waves struck the high freeboard and wind caught every vertical surface. The longship avoided this by refusing to rise above the sea. It sat in the waves rather than on top of them, presenting minimal profile to the wind. When a gust hit, there was less surface to catch it. The ship stayed flatter, more controllable. The crew, already soaked, remained soaked, but they weren't being thrown across the deck with every weather shift. Less windage meant less chaos. Less chaos meant the crew could maintain their positions, keep rowing, keep the ship oriented properly to the waves. That mattered more than staying dry. The hull itself moved, not as a weakness, but as a design feature born from centuries of refinement. Viking shipwrights built clinker style, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, each plank's lower edge covering the upper edge of the one below. The planks weren't rigidly locked together. The rivets allowed flex. The entire hull could twist and bend as waves passed beneath it. Modern ships resist wave energy with rigid hulls. They're built to be stiff, to maintain their shape under stress. When a wave hits, the hull doesn't give. The force transmits through the structure into everything aboard: cargo, masts, crew. It's a collision between solid mass and moving water. The longship absorbed instead of resisted. A wave rolled underneath, and the hull deformed slightly to match its shape, then returned to true as the wave passed. While the ship rode the ocean's movement rather than fighting it. This meant less violent motion, fewer shocks, and critically, less water forced over the rails. Every wave that broke across the deck meant more cold water soaking the crew, more weight sloshing in the bilge, more heat stripped from already freezing bodies. The flexible hull reduced those impacts, not by keeping the ship dry. Nothing kept a longship dry in open ocean, but by letting the vessel dance with the wave energy instead of slamming into it. The open deck forced a different kind of discipline. There was nowhere to retreat, no separate space where off-duty crew could escape the wind. Everyone lived in the same environment, exposed to the same conditions. The helmsman at the steering oar, the lookout at the bow, the rowers at their benches, the navigator checking the sun's position, all occupied the same 60 feet of oak planking. The sea chests doubled as rowing benches, locked into position along the hull. Each rower sat on his own storage, containing his personal provisions, spare clothing, and whatever goods he carried. This wasn't comfort, it was engineering. The chests provided distributed weight low in the hull, improving stability. They kept essential supplies accessible, and they meant every piece of the ship served multiple functions simultaneously. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was ornamental. The ship was a tool refined across generations to do one thing perfectly: move through cold ocean with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. It offered no warmth. But it didn't trap the crew in a false sense of security either. The cold was constant, acknowledged, built into every element of the design. The ship didn't pretend to protect the crew from the sea. It gave them a platform to manage the sea themselves. The wool came first, not as decoration, not as fashion, but as the primary barrier between human skin and water cold enough to kill. Viking age wool wasn't the soft, processed fiber of modern sweaters. It was dense, oily, and coarse, still heavy with lanolin from the sheep that grew it. That oil mattered more than any other single property. Lanolin is hydrophobic. Water doesn't penetrate it easily. When rain or spray hit the outer surface of Viking wool clothing, the droplets beaded and rolled off rather than soaking through immediately. The fabric would eventually become damp. Nothing stayed dry in the North Atlantic, but it took time. And time meant the difference between manageable cold and hypothermia. The fiber structure itself provided the second defense. Wool fibers are crimped, but creating thousands of tiny air pockets throughout the fabric. Air is an excellent insulator when trapped in place. Even when the outer layers of wool became wet, the inner layers, pressed against the body, retained pockets of warmed air. The clothing didn't stop working when it got damp. It just worked less efficiently, which was enough. Most synthetic modern fabrics lose all insulating capacity when wet. Cotton becomes a heat sink, pulling warmth directly from skin. Wool kept insulating. A Viking could be soaked to the skin and still generate enough body heat to survive if the wool layer remained intact. The clothing formed a system, not a single garment. The base layer was linen or lightweight wool, a tunic worn directly against skin. This wickeded moisture away from the body, preventing sweat from accumulating during physical exertion. And when the crew rowed hard, generating intense heat, the base layer pulled that moisture outward into the next layer, rather than letting it pool and then freeze against skin when activity stopped. The mid-layer was thicker wool. This was the primary insulation, a heavier tunic, sometimes trousers, creating the main thermal barrier. The weave was tight enough to block wind, but loose enough to allow moisture to continue moving outward from the base layer. This prevented the dangerous buildup of dampness against the skin while maintaining the crucial air-trapping structure. The outer layer was the heaviest wool of all, often treated with additional fats or oils. Some crews wore leather outer garments. The wealthiest had fur-lined cloaks, bearskin, sealskin, sheepskin with the wool turned inward, as this shell layer took the direct punishment of spray and wind, protecting the insulating layers beneath. The cloak deserves specific attention. It wasn't a coat in the modern sense. Not tailored, not fitted. It was a large rectangle of heavy wool, often 2 meters by 3, fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. Simple, ancient, devastatingly effective. Wrapped properly, the cloak covered a man from neck to ankle. The excess fabric could be pulled over the head as a hood, protecting the face and ears from wind. At night, or during rest periods, the cloak became a blanket, spread over the body, tucked around the legs, creating a personal shelter. When crew members huddled together for warmth during watches, their combined cloaks overlapped to form a larger shared barrier, trapping body heat within the group. The cloak could be shed in seconds when action was required. Fighting, climbing rigging, responding to an emergency. Just unpin the brooch and the entire garment dropped away. When the crisis passed, it went back on just as quickly. No buttons, no laces, no complicated fasteners that frozen fingers couldn't operate. Mittens mattered as much as any other piece of gear. Frostbite kills extremities first. Fingers, toes, nose, ears. Lose feeling in your hands and you can't grip an oar, can't tie a knot, can't perform the constant small tasks that keep a ship operational. Viking mittens were thick wool, often with a leather shell, designed to be worn continuously except during the most delicate work. Footwear followed the same principle. Leather shoes or boots, stuffed with straw or dried grass for insulation, sometimes wrapped with wool windings up the calf. The goal wasn't to keep feet dry, impossible in an open boat taking spray, but to slow heat loss enough that circulation continued. Keep blood flowing to the toes and they survive. Let them go numb and you lose them. Hoods and hats protected the head and neck, where blood vessels run close to the surface and heat escapes rapidly. A simple wool cap under a cloak hood created a microclimate around the skull, trapping warmed air and preventing the wind from stealing heat directly from the scalp. The entire system worked through redundancy. No single layer provided complete protection. But stacked together, each doing its specific job, they created an environment where the human body could maintain core temperature despite conditions that should have killed in hours. Well, this wasn't gear that someone invented on a single winter voyage. This was technology refined across centuries of Arctic and subarctic living, tested by generations of farmers, fishermen, and raiders who learned exactly what worked and what failed. The clothing aboard a longship represented the accumulated survival knowledge of a culture that had been fighting the cold since the Bronze Age. They didn't conquer the North Atlantic despite the cold. They crossed it because they understood the cold better than anyone else alive. Rowing wasn't just propulsion, it was survival. When the wind dropped and the sail went slack, the crew took to the oars not because they needed to maintain speed, but because they needed to maintain heat. 30 men pulling in rhythm generated furnace-level thermal output. Muscles burned through glucose and fat, producing heat as a necessary byproduct of mechanical work. Core temperature climbed, circulation increased. Fingers and toes that had begun to go numb came back to painful, blessed life. The rowing benches were positioned close together, less than a meter between each man's back and the next man's chest. This wasn't accidental crowding. Tight spacing meant shared warmth radiated between bodies. The man in front blocked wind for the man behind. Breath misted and mixed in the narrow gaps between positions, creating pockets of slightly warmer air that persisted for seconds before the wind tore them away. Watch rotations kept exposure manageable. No one stayed at the most exposed positions, bow lookout, steering oar, for more than a few hours. Men cycled through duties, rowing, resting, steering, bailing, checking rigging. The rotation meant everyone took turns at the hardest positions, but no one stayed there long enough for cold to penetrate past the clothing system into core tissue. During rest periods, the crew huddled, not from cowardice or weakness, but from thermal engineering. 5 men pressed together under layered cloaks created a shared environment where body heat accumulated instead of dissipating into endless wind. The center positions were warmest. Those men served as the core of a temporary human furnace. As outer positions rotated regularly, so everyone spent time in the warm center, and everyone took a turn on the cold edge. The diet was fuel, nothing more. Dried fish, cod, herring, packed with protein and fat. Salted pork preserved in barrels, each slice glistening with the fat that hadn't been trimmed away because fat was the point. Hard cheese aged until it could survive weeks without refrigeration. Butter, sometimes rancid by modern standards, eaten in chunks because every gram of fat generated 9 calories of energy to burn against the cold. This wasn't cuisine, it was thermal maintenance. The body needed constant fuel to keep the internal furnace running, and the food provided exactly that. Chapter 5. Survival rested on 3 foundations, each essential, none sufficient alone. The ship managed violence. Its low profile reduced wind exposure. Its flexible hull absorbed wave energy instead of shattering against it. The open deck forced unity. Every man lived in the same brutal environment, aware of every shift in weather, every change in sea state. The longship didn't protect the crew from the ocean. It gave them a stable platform to face it together. The clothing created buffer space. Layered wool trapped air, insulated even when wet, and shed water long enough to matter. The heavy cloak served as garment, blanket, and portable shelter. Mittens and hoods protected extremities where frostbite struck first. This wasn't fashion. It was a wearable microclimate engineered through centuries of Arctic survival. The crew generated heat, while rowing turned muscle into furnace. Huddling transformed individuals into a collective thermal mass. Watch rotations distributed exposure so no one stayed in killing cold long enough to die. High-fat food provided fuel for the internal fire that kept core temperature above the threshold of consciousness. Remove any pillar and the system collapsed. The best ship became a coffin without disciplined crew. The finest wool meant nothing if the hull broke apart. The strongest men froze without proper clothing. But the 4th element mattered most: knowledge. Vikings didn't blunder into freezing seas hoping for luck. They studied wind patterns, read swells, tracked coastal landmarks and celestial positions. They knew when storms were likely and when windows of calmer weather opened. They chose routes that hugged coastlines when possible, but reducing time in open water. They understood currents, where cold water ran, where warmer channels flowed, how ice drifted south in predictable patterns each season. This knowledge minimized exposure. A direct crossing from Norway to Iceland might take 7 days in good conditions. Poor planning could stretch that to 3 weeks of suffering, or end in death when provisions ran out and bodies gave up. Navigation wasn't just about reaching the destination. It was about getting there before the cold won. The Viking longship in freezing water represents something profound: adaptation without dominance. They didn't conquer the North Atlantic. They learned its rhythms and moved within them. Their survival required no technological breakthrough, no single invention, just ruthless integration of design, material, discipline, and accumulated wisdom. It wasn't comfortable, it was effective, and it changed the world.